On the 25th of May 2024, which was coincidentally Africa Day, I attended my first RMB Latitudes Art Fair. This took place in Johannesburg at the beautiful Sheptone Gardens, and I went on the Saturday of the fair. To start, I participated in an insightful art talk about 15 centuries of African sculpture that I had signed up for.
In this conversation, we hope to cultivate an understanding of this rich sculptural history and heritage in the region, as well as to take a look at the evolution of sculptural practices, extending to changes in the societal role of both the object and that of its maker. The reason I'm bringing up is, what is the sculpture? What is this? The sculptural about form? To what extent is it static? To what extent is it dynamic? And what does it tell us about our continent, if we can generalize, about our continent, or we have to speak about it regionally? And also implicitly, what are the key counterpoints between Western aesthetics and African aesthetics?
Done is I've picked I would call them 5 moments of African sculpture, and I was hoping that I'd be able to project. So you're going to have to just be happy with my small screen. So the first known sculpture on the African continent is this clay figure, this terracotta figure, which is from what was excavated in the area of the river Niger. And it's a clay terracotta sculpture, and you can see that the figure is crouched. But I just need to paste this quickly. I'll just do the picture. The figure is crouched, and the theory is that the person was suffering from some kind of affliction, which is what you get the boils on their back, the pustules on their back. So we can come back to this, and I'm just gonna. I hope I can do this. And then my next moment is this very well-known figure in West Africa, in Bamana, in Mali, or amongst the Bambara. It's called the Chihuahua. And what I love about this sculptural form is that the Chihuahua is a representation of an entire legend of how human beings learned to cultivate. So this antelope / pangolin / aardvark, as it's represented in this art, is supposed to have taught human beings how to cultivate the ground by essentially digging with its horns. That's why it has these horns. It dug into the ground with its horns to show human beings how to plant seeds, and it pawed the ground with its hoofs to show human beings how to dig the ground. So what I love about it is exactly the kind of rhythm of the sculpture and the fact that it represents an entire story. And as you hear from the one quote that I use, is that in Africa the sculpture always moves, that it's never stationary, that there's supposed to be some kind of rhythm. So that's the Chihuahua. Then the next one, and this is where for me the mystery begins when it comes to African sculpture, is that in our own part of Southern Africa, we actually do not have, quote unquote, a tradition of figurative sculpture. So when we attempt to represent the human face or the human body. But what we do have are these beautiful headrests, which represent, and they are present across the African continent. And what many people don't realize about these headrests is that many of them are not articulated. So they don't have any joints. There was no glue. People used a single piece of wood to create many of these headrests. And so many of them, to me, represent a kind of sculptural form that in some ways travels with you to the dreamland. So that was the whole idea, was that your status as a human being was represented in these. So there's one from Egypt there. So the one in the background is from Swaziland, circa 20th century. But that one is from ancient Egypt, and it's also not articulated. So it's completely one piece of work, no joints, no joinery.
It's so difficult to find any sort of defining or broader generalizations to speak about African sculpture. I studied history of art and specialized in sculpture in Europe for many years in France. And I was blown away when I moved back to South Africa and realized the richness of a sculptural tradition that existed more specifically within the South African context, and how little literature there was that existed on the topic. So just to speak, it's interesting that you mentioned some of the earlier sculptures that we found in South Africa were in clay, in terracotta, which is a clay that is found throughout the country. And it's interesting also what you mentioned about South African sculpture not usually being associated with figurative sculpture. In terms of ceramic tradition, and I recently spent the last few years writing about contemporary South African artists that are working in ceramics and clay in a sculptural sense. And it was the first publication on South African sculpture in this medium. But what I was blown away by was the rich tradition, many centuries of ceramic vessels that had been developing and existing in parallel to one another in South Africa. And I think if I were to say that there was any one characteristic of South African sculpture in a country that is extremely vast, broad, with multiple cultures that exist in different corners of the country that develop in parallel to one another, sometimes connected, sometimes with no connection at all, is that there is a cross-referencing, a pulling from multiple references, from multiple traditions, that I would say is a characteristic aspect of sculpture in South Africa.
And through cycles and how the African aesthetics, while it is very much connected to movement, to dance, to spirituality, to all those dynamic conditions that are central to the making of the forms themselves, are precisely what are deactivated in the heightened aestheticization of those aesthetics when adopted in the European context. The one thing that Neville also brings up, he says, and I thought it was very interesting that you might wish to discuss, he says here, as well, to take a look at the evolution of sculptural practice, extending to changes in the societal role of both the object and that of its maker. I'm thinking about now, in terms of African sculpture now, how does the artist relate to the object? How does the artist conceive themselves as a maker? Have things changed, or has it always been this way?
And so for me, that relationship is like super intertwined with everything that's happening in my life and everything that's going on in the world. But like aesthetically, I don't know, I guess I pull from everywhere subconsciously. I don't know if I have a particular aesthetic, but I do know I have a very intimate practice of making. And kind of a very open practice where whatever it is has a freedom to kind of come out however it wishes or however it appeared visually to begin with. And
so thoughts when we're speaking about like art and sculpture and dates and all these things, I think it's a big obsession about like categorizing things. So like when we talk about dates and like you brought these examples here, I think we kind of like lack the sensibility of like considering what the object was for. So for instance, when we're thinking now, we're seeing these objects and we're thinking like, cool, this is a sculpture. I think when we're talking about like these objects that are made, I think there was something else that it was made for, something else that we're missing out. Maybe there's a ritual, maybe there's a reason why these things are made. And I think like even now, like in relation to like be a creator now and making these things, I think until we know the intention, I think it's kind of like difficult to categorize things. So for instance, if I'm making a sculpture, for instance, I don't think I ever make an object by itself to stand alone to be looked at, you know. So like a sculpture for me, it forms part of a whole discussion amongst like different things. So I think in the same way we talk about like African art and all these things, I think we miss out on those things where when we're creating now, some people are making sculptures and I feel like besides looking at them and seeing the craftsmanship, like what else is there? I think there's a lack that we're missing out on a lot of things. And I think it's why when you see a lot of sculptures now, it's kind of empty. You see the thing and then that's that. I think there's a lack of like a conversation that happens around. So I think until someone says it's a sculpture, I don't think it's a sculpture.
What you just mentioned, I was just reading this morning, somebody said, you know, today with sculptures, they know better what materials to use to make something, but they don't know why they need to make something.
Yeah.
Which is the point you're making as well.
After all that food for thought about African sculpture, I took some time out to relax and refuel in the gorgeous gardens before taking in more art around me. Abdus Salam's stand, which was nominated as one of the best, was calming and spiritually moving to experience. What I love about art fairs is that there's always such a variety of artwork from subject to medium used that you will definitely find what interests you. Portraiture in particular is often popular because it creates immediate human connection and reflection. I recognized Norman O'Flynn's detailed eye-catching work once again at an art fair. Some stands were interesting because they had a variety of 2D and 3D elements to tell their story. I was so happy to see my girl Annelisa Manzo at her stand with Under the Ages. It was the Audience Award winner for the best stand in the end, which was exciting. I found renowned visual artist Dada Kanyisa at the stand too. What I loved about the Sheptone Gardens as a venue was how getting to different art hubs was an adventure as you navigated the different paths with spectacular views along the way. A highlight was spotting the work of an artist I know, Pindile Mamba, from Eswatini where I was born and raised. I was mesmerized by the gorgeous details of some of the exhibition spaces. I also liked how there were art installations on the grounds. I spotted these Nandi Pamdambo sculptures that fit into the surroundings. Renowned artist Nelson Makama also had a space dedicated to his work at the top. Sadly, I missed seeing him as he had been there the previous day. It was fascinating to see some rug artwork by artists such as Maya Maljevic and Lulama Wolf, who are known for their 2D painting. I noticed that there were artfully designed rain routers throughout the fair that kept us connected to the Wi-Fi. This was part of a partnership with 6 Latitude artists to produce a limited edition 101 Skins art collection. This one is by Maya Maljevic. Evidently, her distinct work attracts me. After a search and having to go down a labyrinth, I finally found the Usurper stand, which was nominated as one of the best. The special project Don't Look Back was impressive, with the work of artists in traditional media like Nandi Pamdambo's sculpture turned into 3D animation. I then found my way back to the mezzanine talks area to close my RMB Latitudes Art Fair experience with another art talk by Latitudes Live. This one was about new institutions beyond the white cube. The talk's curator, Lebo Kekana, gave us an introduction to the discussion.
There's a moment together, to think together, to reflect together, to engage in simple terms. The name of this conversation is called New Institutions Beyond the White Cube. We're trying to think beyond the white cube. Now, essentially what this program is an effort to think of how, as Africa, if I may say, we relate to the white cube space or the modernist gallery space, or more broadly, just thinking about the formal spaces of art consumption. Now, we've gathered this lovely group of panelists, these very exceptional experts, who will give you kind of context
into their work, who they are, why they are here. But before I hand over to them, what we'd like for this to be is not just a kind of like one-way engagement. We'd like to be in conversation with them.
After several hours at the fair, which still did not feel like enough to take in all the art, and unpacking a lot at the talks, it was time to head out. I greatly enjoyed my first time at the RMB Latitudes Art Fair in such a refreshing space and definitely would love to return next year.